This is the island of Ireland. The island is politically split between the Republic of Ireland, an independent country, and Northern Ireland, which, together with Scotland, England and Wales, form the United Kingdom. But why exactly is Ireland split, and when did it happen? To fully understand the situation, we need to go all the way back to the 12th century. After the Normans had successfully invaded England and taken the throne, they decided to invade Ireland. Henry II, with the authorisation of Pope Adrian IV to strengthen the papacy's control over the Irish Church, landed in Ireland in 1171 and took control of large parts of the island, and in the following year the Lordship of Ireland was created, in which the Lord of Ireland was also the King of England. The Lordship of Ireland was a papal possession held by the King of England. This was the beginning of what would become centuries of English and later British rule over the island of Ireland. Officially, the Lordship of Ireland ruled over the entire island, but in reality control was much less than this, and over the years English control of Ireland receded over time. This was a time before there was a religious difference between Ireland and England. The English and the native Irish were both Catholic nations, as this was a time before the emergence of Protestantism, so many of the Normans in Ireland assimilated into Irish culture, and some were said to have become more Irish than the Irish themselves. Laws were introduced which banned intermarriage between English settlers and the Gaelic Irish, as well as a ban on the use of the Irish language, but these laws were largely ineffective. By the late 15th century, English rule was limited to an area known as the Pale. The early 16th century and what became known as the Protestant Reformation, in which many European powers turned their back on the Roman Catholic Church, forming a new branch of the Christian faith. Although the Reformation was about religion, it also had a lot to do with politics as well. With Henry VIII as the King of England, the Pope refused to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. This, as well as other contributing factors, caused Henry VIII to break away from the Roman Catholic Church and establish the Church of England, with himself as the leader. With this, the political situation in Ireland became uncertain, as Ireland was a papal possession with the King of England as Lord of Ireland. In 1542, after an Act of Irish Parliament, Henry VIII was proclaimed King of Ireland, as the Lordship of Ireland became the Kingdom of Ireland. However, Henry VIII was not recognised by the Catholic powers throughout Europe. After Henry VIII's death in 1547, his Protestant-raised 9-year-old son Edward VI ascended to the throne, but he died of illness just a few years later at the age of 15. Mary I, Henry VIII's daughter, was next in line to the throne, and since Mary was nearly 20 years older than her half-brother Edward, she was raised before the Protestant Reformation and was therefore Catholic. Because of this, Mary I was recognised as the Queen of Ireland. Ireland had remained loyal to the Pope, and the island was almost entirely Catholic. In 1603, after the death of Queen Elizabeth I, the last of the Tudor dynasty, James VI of Scotland also became King of England because of his somewhat unique family ancestry, in which he was the son of Mary I, Queen of Scots, and also the great-great-grandson of Henry VII. He was therefore known as James I, King of England, and also King of Ireland as well. This was known as the Union of the Crowns, in which Scotland, England and Ireland all shared a common monarch. In 1609, under James I's reign, the Plantation of Ulster was a process by which Scottish and English settlers confiscated land from the Gaelic Irish. This was seen as a way to stop rebellion in the north, as Ulster had been a region of Ireland most resistant to English rule. Although there had been plenty of plantations in Ireland throughout the years, the Plantation of Ulster was by far the most successful, and within just a few decades the Protestant colonist population was thriving, and even made up a majority in some areas in the north. In 1641, Irish Catholics in Ulster staged a rebellion against the settlers, which led to the Irish Confederate Wars between the Irish Catholic Confederation and the Scottish and English settlers. Most of the island of Ireland was under de facto Irish Catholic rule for several years. This was until 1649, when Oliver Cromwell and his new model army conquered Ireland after overthrowing the English monarchy, executing Charles I and declaring himself Lord Protector of Scotland, England and Ireland. Cromwell ruled over the three kingdoms until his death in 1658. During this time there was more confiscation of land from the native Catholics, and anyone even suspected of being involved in the 1641 rebellion was executed. His son Richard very briefly ruled afterwards, but the monarchy was restored in 1660 when Charles II became king, son of the executed Charles I. Charles II was Protestant, but his brother James II had converted to Catholicism during his time in France, so when Charles II died in 1685, Scotland, England and Ireland once again had a Catholic monarch. At this point, the majority of people in Scotland and England were Protestant, and many were uneasy with James II as their monarch. However, next in line to the throne was his daughter Mary, who was Protestant. This all changed in 1688 with the birth of his son, the would-be James III, who would undoubtedly be raised Catholic. The only reason his daughter Mary was Protestant was because his late brother and former king demanded she be raised as such. So with this change, it looked like Scotland and England would have a Catholic monarchy for the foreseeable future. The birth of the King's son sparked what became known as the Glorious Revolution, in which the two major political parties invited William of Orange to invade England and take the throne. William of Orange successfully defeated his father-in-law, who also happened to be his uncle since William and Mary were first cousins, and they took the throne together as William III and Mary II, King and Queen of England. Of course, this also made them King and Queen of Ireland, and with a Catholic majority this was obviously not received well. This started a war in Ireland between the native Irish, led by James II, who were mainly Catholic, against the kingdoms of Scotland and England. The Williamite War in Ireland resulted in victory for King William. For the next century, Catholic majority Ireland was ruled by a Protestant minority known as the Protestant Ascendancy. In 1707, the Kingdom of Scotland and the Kingdom of England joined to create the Kingdom of Great Britain. And then in 1798 there was an uprising against British rule in Ireland in the Irish Rebellion of 1798, inspired by the French Revolution a decade earlier. The rebellion failed, but it caused a lot of uncertainty on the political situation of Ireland. There were concerns that Ireland might ally themselves with France and break away from British rule. So in 1801, Ireland joined the Union and became the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Opposition to the Union was strong and occasionally escalated into violence. The late 1800s saw a rise in demand for self-government, and in 1886 the first Home Rule Bill was proposed. In response to this, the Liberal Unionist Party was created in support of the Union and opposed Irish Home Rule. The bill failed, as did the second bill proposed in 1892, but in 1914 the third Home Rule Bill was passed. But 1914 was also the year in which World War I started, and therefore the bill had to be put on hold. With the British Army still occupied with the war in Europe, Irish Republicans staged a rebellion in Dublin called the Easter Rising, with a goal of putting an end to British rule in Ireland and establishing an Irish Republic. The rising took place over the course of just a few days, but nearly 500 people died, most of whom were civilians. But with far superior numbers, the British Army managed to suppress the rebellion. The result was an unconditional surrender by the rebel forces, and most of the rebel leaders were executed. In the 1918 UK general election, an Irish political party called Sinn Féin, who supported Irish independence, and many of their members had participated in the Easter Rising, won 73 of the 105 Irish seats at the British Parliament. But they chose to not take their seats at the British Parliament and instead decided to form their own Irish Parliament and proclaim an Irish Republic as a newly independent country. The Irish Republic claimed the whole island of Ireland, but there was a lot of support for the Union in the north, especially in Ulster, in which 4 of the 9 counties won a Unionist majority. This led to the Irish War for Independence, primarily between the IRA and the British Army. In 1920, with the war still ongoing, a 4th Home Rule Bill was passed, superseding the 3rd Home Rule Bill that was passed but never implemented. This partitioned Ireland into Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. Northern Ireland consisted of 6 of the 9 counties of Ulster. This was despite 2 of them having a Catholic majority. The rest of the island became Southern Ireland. The split was intended to be a temporary solution to the war. So Ireland would remain part of the United Kingdom with Home Rule, but instead of having 1 Irish Parliament in Dublin, there would be 2, one in Dublin for Southern Ireland and one in Belfast for Northern Ireland. This was an attempt to meet demands of both Irish nationalists and Irish Unionists. And while the Northern Irish government was successfully established, the Southern Irish government was not. The war continued and the Southern Irish government never functioned. The Irish War for Independence lasted for 2.5 years, resulting in a ceasefire and the Anglo-Irish Treaty. The treaty established the Irish Free State, which would become a dominion of the British Commonwealth, along with the likes of Canada, Australia and South Africa, among others at the time. The treaty included the whole island of Ireland, but had an opt-out clause for Northern Ireland, which they immediately exercised, so the short-lived Southern Ireland became the Irish Free State. Some were happy with this situation, but others were not. Many were unhappy that Ireland was still part of the British Empire and wanted total independence. So the Irish nationalists were split between the pro-treaty nationalists and the anti-treaty nationalists. The political party Sinn Féin split into 2 separate parties: pro-treaty Sinn Féin that was happy with the status quo, and the anti-treaty Sinn Féin that sought full independence. In the 1922 Irish general election, the 2 political parties that won the most seats were Sinn Féin and Sinn Féin, with the pro-treaty party winning more seats. The disagreement escalated into civil war just 1 year after the end of the War for Independence. Many men who had fought together in Ireland's War for Independence were now on opposing sides of a civil war. The pro-treaty forces emerged victorious, affirming the status of the Irish Free State a British dominion. After the war, the anti-treaty Sinn Féin refused to take their seats at the Irish Parliament in protest of the treaty. Because of this, their leader, Eamon de Valera, resigned from the party and founded a new political party, Fianna Fáil, and they became the dominant political party in Ireland from 1932 onwards. He strongly opposed the treaty as well, but thought his former party's tactics were not helpful. In 1937, a referendum was held for a new constitution to remove all British ties from Ireland. 56% of people voted in favour, and Ireland adopted a new constitution, becoming a fully independent country. The country changed its name to Ireland. Just Ireland. The country is often referred to as the Republic of Ireland to differentiate itself from the island of Ireland, but its official name is simply Ireland. This was to reflect the fact that Ireland's claimed territory was the entire island, believing the partition of Ireland to be illegitimate. Despite this claim though, Northern Ireland continued as normal, as part of the United Kingdom. Ireland exercised their independence by choosing to remain neutral in World War II, which started just 2 years later. And while that should be the end of the story, there were 3 decades of ongoing violence from the late 1960s to 1990s in a period known as the Troubles. The violence was mainly concentrated in Northern Ireland, but occasionally spilled over into Ireland, England and even mainland Europe. Although the majority of Northern Ireland's population was Protestant and Unionist, there was a substantial minority that were Catholic and nationalist and wanted Northern Ireland to join the Republic. After 3 decades of conflict between various organisations and thousands of casualties, a ceasefire was called to put a stop to the violence in 1998 with the Good Friday Agreement. The agreement caused the Republic of Ireland to amend their constitution, removing their territorial claim over Northern Ireland, and the British and Irish governments agreed that if a majority of people in Northern Ireland wish to leave the United Kingdom and join the Republic, the governments will make it happen. The lasting impact of the Troubles can still be seen today, especially in Belfast, in which there are walls that separate Protestant and Catholic communities, and there is still occasional violence. However, the situation is improving, and the government has made a goal to remove all of these so-called peace walls by the year 2023.
Derry. The Northern Ireland border town was another scene of violence in a black weekend. What started as a peaceful civil rights march turned into a battlefield. Despite appeals by march leaders for no violence, trouble flared when steel-helmeted police altered the marchers' route to exclude a Protestant area of the town. As a protest, the marchers refused to take the alternative route. It resulted first in deadlock, then violence. The fighting raged into the early dusk. Demonstrators captured and burned 5 single-deck police buses and pushed another into a canal. The police watched silently and did not intervene. "20 people were eventually arrested at the end of this violent day. 5 policemen were reported injured. Londonderry. This was the peaceful prelude to days of rioting and violence, the beginning of a new and bloody chapter in the grim history of the city. As the Apprentice Boys Parade, a traditional Protestant march, wound its way through the streets, there was no hint of the violence that was to rip Londonderry apart. It was only when the march was almost over that tempers began to get frayed. Stones were thrown from the Catholic Bogside area. Within minutes, barricades were going up, and militant MP Bernadette Devlin was addressing the crowd. The police prepared to defend themselves from the stones that were already beginning to hail down on them. Protestants gathered to reply to the Catholic stone. More barricades went up. Tempers fled. The crowds linked arms, and within minutes, Londonderry was in the grip of the most savage and senseless rioting it has yet seen, with Bogside the battleground. Dusk fell, the battle raged on. Rioters threw stones, iron bars, and then petrol bombs. And as the flames illuminated the scene of conflict, casualties mounted. It was reminiscent of the Blitz. As buildings blazed, the rioters sheltered behind their barricades to make more petrol bombs. Police used tear gas, and 300 British troops stood by on the outskirts of the city. Ulster's agonizing experience may hold grave consequences for the future.
I ask those who will quite sincerely consider the use of internment powers as evil to answer honestly this question: is it more of an evil than to allow the perpetrators of these outrages to remain at liberty? I cannot guarantee that the action we have now taken will bring this campaign swiftly to an end. We may yet have to endure as a community, but if we endure with courage and steadiness, the utter defeat of terrorism is sure.
When you're weary, feeling small, when tears are in your eyes, I'll dry them all. I'm on your side when times get rough, and friends just can't be found, like a bridge over troubled water. I will lay me down like a bridge over troubled water. I will lay me down.
The violent reaction to the introduction of internment without trial in the North, which is seen to be a deliberate decision by the Stormont administration to attempt the outright repression of the minority, is not surprising. But my government must make decisions in the light of the realities that exist, particularly so when emotions run high.
Comfort you. I'll take your part.
How many children do you have?
6.
And where will they all be going?
Somewhere down the south. We don't know where we're going yet.
And pain is all around.
This is your country as much as ours. The politicians in the south have let us down badly. It's up to you to come forward on your own bat. And if I might make so bold as to make an appeal to the Free State Army to disregard the orders of the politicians and rally to the support of our beleaguered people here in the north.
You think that this kind of limitation would be acceptable or possible in a democracy, say, like the United States?
Well, I can't speak of the United States. I speak of our own country, where we have conditions bordering on civil war in the north, where we have an organization which has received absolutely no democratic mandate whatever from the people of either the south or the north for their illegal activities, trying to influence the minds of young people in the way I've described. And we think that under the circumstances, the National Broadcasting Organization, while giving absolutely full and impartial reports of news in the north, should not permit this kind of propaganda presentation.
In the Northern Ireland city of Londonderry, a Catholic civil rights march is underway. Tension in the area between Catholics, Protestants and the British Army, specifically members of the Parachute Regiment, had been growing for weeks. Civil rights protest was turning into a riot as more and more Catholic youths began to shower the security forces with stones, petrol bombs and other missiles. The troops opened fire, the crowd scattered. When the shooting stopped, the casualties were counted. 13 Catholics dead, another 17 wounded. As the shock of it all began to take hold, it wasn't long before that sad day became known as Bloody Sunday, another date in the Irish calendar of tragedy, another setback on the road to any prospect of peace.
On the 31st of July 1972, the British Army launched its largest ground operation since the Suez Crisis of 1956. Over 22,000 British troops, supported by HMS Fearless, Centurion tanks and bulldozers, poured into Northern Ireland, determined to end the barricaded no-go areas in Belfast, Derry and beyond, once and for all, and to crush the IRA in the process.
We knew that the army were going to come in that night. We knew they were going to break through all the barricades.
I suppose I was thinking and planning about what would happen next in terms of our fight against the IRA.
If I step out onto the street, I'll be arrested or worse, killed. What do I do?
I think what did come as a big surprise was the scale of it, which was absolutely enormous.
The purpose was, the aim was to clear the no-go areas, and it certainly did that.
In scenes reminiscent of a war zone and never seen before or since in the United Kingdom, the full might of the British Army's military hardware was deployed onto civilian streets as thousands of troops flooded into ordinary communities, determined to reinstate the force of British law. "1972 was the most violent year of the conflict. Just 3 years on from their origins in street protests and riots in 1969, the Troubles had become a bloody fight between the IRA, the British Army, and loyalist paramilitaries. The year began ominously, with January seeing the deaths of 2 policemen in Derry being followed within days by the killings of 14 civilians on Bloody Sunday.
My memory of it was great political upheaval, obviously. That was your Bloody Sunday, and term without trial was still in place. You had the fall of Stormont, the imposition of direct rule. You also had a full-blown guerrilla war going on in the streets between the IRA and the British Army.
My first tour was mainly riot control and protecting property. On the second tour, it was more gun battles and bombs, and the violence has increased terribly in those 2 years.
The no-go areas created conditions in which paramilitary groups could thrive, and as they took hold, it became clear that removing the barricades would provoke major clashes. Clashes which would firmly set the army in opposition to the nationalist populations of Belfast and Derry. The origins of the no-go areas lay in the street protests of 1969 and opposition to the RUC, but they'd been largely allowed to remain in place by Westminster in those early days of the conflict, as the government sought to avoid all-out confrontation and negotiate a path away from worsening violence. As it became clearer through 1969 and 1970 that conflict and confrontation were intensifying, the barricades became a real problem for the government. Whilst the introduction of internment in 1971 was aimed at tackling the IRA, the thorny issue of no-go was never fully addressed.
Belfast and the New Lodge was different, for example, than Derry. It was quite obvious that, Derry was under the control of large sections of it, of the IRA, and the British weren't going into those areas.
The reaction of the IRA to the breakdown of talks was delivered on the 21st of July. Bloody Friday saw 9 people killed by 22 separate bombs in Belfast city centre. It was seen as one of the most shocking events of the conflict. Bloody Friday was also the event that galvanised Westminster into large-scale military action against the IRA and set the tone for the following 22 years of conflict. Since the beginning of the year, Stormont had failed, negotiation had failed, and the killings had intensified. Faced with a desperate and deteriorating situation, the British government turned to the army to defeat the IRA. Once the decision had been made to take military action against the no-go areas and remove them by force, a planning process swung into action at military and political levels in Belfast and London. If the army were going to be used, then it would be in a decisive show of strength to remove the barricades and send the message to paramilitaries on all sides that there was no prospect of a military victory in Northern Ireland. As it was planned, Motorman evolved into the biggest single British military operation since the Suez Crisis of 1956. As the plan developed, it became clear that almost 30,000 troops were required, including 5,500 members of the Ulster Defence Regiment, as well as Centurion demolition vehicles and HMS Fearless. As the troops were prepared and shipped into Northern Ireland, they were briefed on the operation at hand, but were largely unsure what to expect. Whilst the soldiers were prepared for organised resistance from the IRA, Republicans on the ground had other ideas. Faced with such a scale of operation, they knew that to fight would be foolish in the extreme. At a political level, there was a clear desire from the British to avoid confrontation, and the decision was taken to telegraph the operation and give every indication of what was planned. In the days preceding Motorman, troop levels surged and military activity was at an all-time high across Northern Ireland. It was clear that a major operation was in the offing. As the early hours of the 31st of July came, residents of the no-go areas waited nervously for the operation to begin. Whatever Motorman would bring, it would be at a scale previously unknown on the conflicted streets of Northern Ireland. With the decision taken to give warning of the beginning of Operation Motorman, it came as no surprise when the troops swung into action in the early hours of the 31st of July. Despite this forewarning and the intense speculation about Motorman, its scale was still a shock to many on the ground in Northern Ireland. Whilst the operation to clear Derry's no-go areas saw the deaths of 2 young men, in Belfast, Motorman appeared more successful. Just hours after Motorman had commenced, there was a stark reminder that ending the no-go areas would not in itself bring an end to the conflict. Shortly after 10 a.m. on the morning of the 31st of July, 3 bombs exploded without warning in the village of Claudy, a few miles outside of Derry city. 6 civilians were killed immediately, with a further 3 dying later from their injuries. Whilst it's not clear that the bombs were directly connected to Motorman, Claudy underlined the fact that the conflict would not be easily ended. But despite the horror of Claudy, Motorman did have an immediate impact on the spiralling violence that had characterised the first half of 1972. Faced with military occupation on every street, Republicans were forced to rethink their strategies.
I mean, you had foot patrols literally of 120 soldiers coming down Beachmount Parade into Beachmount Avenue under the Falls Road, so it was quite intimidating. I mean, it looked like a major occupation. But as I said, I mean, the IRA quickly adapted to that situation. In fact, I think there's probably an argument being made that they had too many soldiers, and that there was a finite number of soldiers that could work at optimum doing the job of trying to curtail and curb the IRA.
I was in the city and remained in the city for many weeks after Operation Motorman, and many of my friends also remained in the city. And of course the British were searching for us all over the place, but I still moved around, and obviously we had to disguise ourselves and so forth, and there were actually several occasions in the weeks after Operation Motorman where I was physically stopped and searched by the British Army, who hadn't got the foggiest notion that I was Martin McGuinness. So I presume if I had been arrested at that time, I in all probability would have been either shot or interned.
The death rate of July 1972 was never surpassed, as Motorman helped to bring Northern Ireland back from the brink. Such troop levels were not sustainable, and as the operation was wound down in December 1972, the British Army were able to claim that they had returned the rule of law to the streets of Northern Ireland.
Well, the operation's gone very well. As a result of what we started at 4 o'clock this morning, the position now in Northern Ireland is that anyone can go anywhere at any time, and that's what I wanted to achieve.
But what Motorman had really achieved was to change the dynamic of the conflict and send a clear message from Westminster that the British government were prepared to take on the IRA with real resources and give Northern Ireland their fullest attention. This presented a challenge which the IRA simply evolved to meet, and the tone was set for a further 22 years of military confrontation, but in a changed context of full British engagement, which made any military victory for the IRA unlikely and ultimately helped create the conditions for a political settlement to be reached.
It's based on the recognition of the two traditions in Northern Ireland, the Unionist, Protestant, orange one, and the Nationalist, Catholic, green one. What they were trying to do was to make the present system, including the police, the courts and the UDR, acceptable to the Catholic minority, and to make a genuinely devolved government possible in Northern Ireland.
The declaration reflects the belief of both governments, but it does not compromise the principles of either government. We believe that the people of both traditions in Northern Ireland can stand with us on the grounds we have set out in this declaration. We don't ask them to compromise their beliefs, their aspirations, or their democratic rights. Indeed, we seek to enhance those rights, to create an environment in which they can go about their business, their own affairs, their own lives, their own future, free from fear and free from coercion.
After weeks of speculation, the long-awaited IRA ceasefire was finally announced this morning. Just after 11 o'clock at a location in central Dublin, an IRA intermediary handed RTE News a copy of the statement plus a cassette outlining the details of the ceasefire, which comes into effect from midnight tonight. The 300-word statement says that recognising the potential of the current situation and in order to enhance the democratic peace process, they have decided that as of midnight tonight there will be a complete cessation of military operations and that all IRA units have been instructed accordingly. The statement goes on to talk about the historic crossroads which has now been reached and salutes the various members of the Republican movement who've been involved in the struggle for the past 25 years. It goes on to say that following the gains which have been made by nationalists, the IRA believes an opportunity to secure a just and lasting settlement has been created.
Good evening. A historic day at Stormont. After 2 years of talks and after a generation of bloodshed and decades of division and acrimony, George Mitchell ushers in what the whole island hopes will be a new era of peace. An agreement that unites Loyalist and Republican, Unionist and Nationalist leaders in a wide-ranging historical accord.
The two Prime Ministers emerged just before 6 this evening to inaugurate the historic agreement they hope will usher in a new era for the island. There was praise for the Taoiseach and for the parties from Tony Blair, who paid tribute to all who had lost their lives in the conflict, suggesting that the nature of today's deal would change relationships in Northern Ireland forever.
The principle of consent is absolute and is throughout the agreement. And the breakthrough is that that is now accepted by all, North and South. Also, those who believe in a united Ireland can make that case now by persuasion, not violence or threats.
A view echoed by the Taoiseach.
My ultimate political aspiration remains the coming together of all the people of Ireland, achieved peacefully and by consent. I value deeply the close relationship between the Irish government and the British government. But I look forward equally to a new era of friendship and reconciliation between Unionists and Nationalists, in which each tradition can learn truly the value of the other.